Hola, bonjour. That's about it. That's all I know. Welcome to the Property Podcast. It is Rob B with Rob D, and we are here for episode 186 of the Property Podcast. And yes, I've given it away. This week we're looking at overseas property. We're going around the world.
Yeah, I can add Guten Tag to that list. I think that's about as far as I can get.
It's early. It's 7 a.m. I can't do it.
No, the coffee hasn't quite kicked in yet. But luckily, we know a little bit more about property investing around the world than we do about languages of the world. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. If you want to go beyond the UK, broaden your horizons a bit, catch a bit of sun while you're there, it all sounds quite appealing, doesn't it? Well, it can be, but there's also things to watch out for. So in this episode, we're going to give you some areas to look at and some tips for how to make sure it goes well. We've, of course, got a resource and a news story for you as well. But first, it's the first Thursday of the month. What can that possibly mean, Rob?
Netflix night? No. Property Hub meetups, of course. First Thursday of every month. Absolutely love it. Put it in your diary. First Thursday of every month, Property Hub meetups. We've got them all over the place. Tonight, we've got a launch meetup, which Mr. D will be there. The Waterloo meetup in London. I think that's going to be a popular one. So make sure you get there. And last week, I didn't announce where I'm going, but I'm happy to say that I'm going to the Colchester meetup for the first time. So really looking forward to that. So if you're in the Colchester area, please do get along. I'll be there. If you're London-based, get to Waterloo. But if you're not anywhere near any of those places, don't worry. Go to thepropertyhub.net/meetup, and there are places dotted around the whole of the UK and, which is nice for this episode, around the world too.
Yes, indeed. So if you're in Denmark or Hong Kong or one of a couple of other places, you needn't feel like you're missing out. But also, if you're anywhere around the UK, you'll probably find a meetup near you. So propertyhub.net/meetups is the place to go. If you're listening to this bright and early on a Thursday and you feel like getting along to one tonight, it's not too late. Just get along there and book. Okay, onwards to our news story this week. And well, David Cameron's legacy seems to be getting dismantled bit by bit. He's not the Prime Minister, now he's not the MP, and now one of his flagship policies, Help to Buy, has been scrapped.
It has, but beware of the headlines, because Help to Buy has been scrapped, but just one version of it. So there are two versions of Help to Buy. There is the Help to Buy that is available against any property. You could use the Help to Buy scheme to go and buy a new build or an existing built property and put 5% down. The government would guarantee the other 20% and the lenders would lend you 75%. That is coming to a close. That's ending this year. However, the other Help to Buy scheme, which is probably not quite as attractive because it's an equity share, is still in place, and that's for new builds. Although it's been very, very popular. They've done about 50-50. So 50% of the Help to Buy schemes that have been taken up have been with one scheme, and then obviously the other. One of them is coming to an end though, but the other one for new builds is going to keep going until 2020. Well, that's what they're saying at the moment. We'll see how long it lasts. So, interesting. The government comments that there's a lot of confidence in the market, especially the mortgage market right now, because there are lenders lending 95% loans without the guarantee at all. So it does make sense to pull that one away. There's no point in carrying on if the market has regained its confidence. That was the whole point of bringing it in the first place. So sensible move. The ISA Help to Buy scheme continues and the new build Help to Buy scheme continues, but the general one, the one that you could use against any type of property, is now ended.
And I'll also put a link in to a quick story about the Help to Buy ISA, because I didn't realise, and I don't think anyone realised, but the promise is that you'll be able to use it to, the implication is you'll be able to use it towards a deposit for a home. But weirdly, it turns out you can't. That's another news story that came out this week related to this. You actually only get it after you've completed. You can't use the ISA savings towards the deposit, which seems very strange. But in any case, we'll link to those stories. And yeah, it seems to make sense to me that that element of the Help to Buy scheme was time for it to end. So both of those will be linked to in the show notes at thepropertyhub.net/around the world. Speaking of which,
do love a bit of upbeat music, Rob.
Yeah, when we were putting this episode together, I've sort of had that in my head for pretty much the whole time. I was wondering, I thought it was just me maybe showing my age, but actually we're the same age, so maybe it is just us. But anyway, we enjoyed that. This week's topic is, of course, property investment around the world. So we're talking about it on the podcast. It's also going to be a big feature in the next issue of the magazine. So if you are a subscriber to the Property Hub magazine, the next issue is going to drop at the start of November. And there's going to be a big 5-page feature about this exact topic, covering some of the material that we're talking about today and more. So do make sure that you check that out if it's a topic you're interested in. And it's a topic that is really good to cover because we do get asked about it a fair bit. It's the kind of thing that a lot of people are attracted to, and it can be a really good thing, but it can be a risky business as well. So we're going to talk about some specific areas where you might want to look at for various reasons. But let's get started by covering why. Why do people look abroad? There's plenty of different areas in the UK. There's plenty of different areas in the UK that you can buy. I was about to say there's plenty of property in the UK. There's actually a shortage, but let's gloss over that. But what is it that makes people get itchy feet when it comes to property investment?
It's interesting because the amounts of people, Rob, that have been saying, oh, I'm looking at overseas property, it just seems to be increasing recently. And maybe that's a sign that people are looking for diversification, which is the first reason of why you may consider moving abroad. Or maybe it's because the economy's a little bit stronger in the UK, so people are more confident to look elsewhere. Who knows? It's something that I've talked about previously on the podcast. I've personally been hurt around the 2008 time through overseas property. So this is an episode that it's going to be an easy and hard one to talk about. Lots of experience, but also a bit of pain. But hopefully you can learn from that. So, as we said, the first reason you may consider looking abroad is diversification. You may be heavy in the UK. You may have a good spread against the UK. So you've done the south, you've done the north, you've got a great mix. But you're thinking, okay, I'm very, very weighted to UK property. Property is my thing. I don't want to look at stocks and bonds, which is fine if that's not for you. But I want to look elsewhere. So you can look at other countries. There's plenty of them. So that's one reason people consider it. Another is currency hedge. The pound is taking a battering recently. And if all your assets are in the UK, then all your assets are worth less if you're outside the UK. Now, if you're in the UK, it doesn't hurt you as much. However, if you owned a property in the US or Europe, just on currency alone, your property would be more valuable to you because you've got property and asset in a different country, so therefore a different currency. So there are solid reasons for looking abroad.
Yeah, there are. And although I said that there are plenty of different areas in the UK, there are areas abroad that have got unique features that you might want to tap into. So just like in the UK, there are areas that might give you particularly high yields, and there might be areas that have particularly high growth potential. Abroad, those are exaggerated. So there are countries where property is very, very cheap. And for whatever reason, there could be the potential for it to double or triple from where it is now, whereas that's unlikely to happen anywhere in the UK. You can also get extremely high yields in certain places, higher yields than you'd get in the UK. So these are unique things that you have to go abroad in order to get. And another reason, which can't be overlooked, is the utility value of it. People often want a holiday home that's also an investment. So I think this is very, very common. You get people who go, well, I really like going to Spain. I like spending time there. Instead of shelling out for a hotel, let's buy somewhere, rent it out when we're not there, and that will cover our costs or it'll make us some profit. So that was something that was very common before the crash, probably a little bit less so now, but still a motivator for a lot of people. So this is like property, not just as a pure investment, but something that can be a good investment and can make you money at the same time. So everything from kind of pleasure to like pure practicality and logic. There are loads of reasons for going abroad.
So let's get specific. Let's look at different countries. And I think we should start with probably the most popular for UK investors when they look overseas, Spain.
Yeah, and Spain is probably where lots of people have had very bad experiences as well, because it was hit very hard in the crash. In certain areas, property absolutely plummeted. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One being overbuilding. Because it was so popular, when it was easy to get finance and get approval for these schemes, they just threw up so much property, and then everyone pulled out and got scared, and there's now just way too much. And the other reason is some slightly dodgy schemes. So again, when the money was flowing, there were lots of incentives for people to put up schemes where there wasn't the correct permission or they weren't using it in the right way. So some people are finding not just that their investment had lost value, but also that it's not allowed to be there anymore and it's going to get knocked down. So some people had some really hard experiences in Spain. But now it's looking like maybe it's bottomed out and it's starting to come back again. But there are some really big variations to watch out for in Spain. So even now, even all these years on, there is huge domestic unemployment. Youth unemployment, I think, is still over 40%. It's really not good. And as a result, in certain cities, rents have fallen a really long way. So what you often see is that even when capital values fall, rents stay pretty solid because, of course, people still need somewhere to live. But there are cities like Valencia, for example, where rents have fallen a really long way because it's the case that people are having to move back in with their parents and stuff because there is this massive youth unemployment. So prices have fallen, but rents have fallen as well. And in cities like Valencia, there's still lots of vacancy as well. So although prices are low and although they might have bottomed out, there are still risks there and it's not a particularly strong market in certain places. But that's the domestic market. Tourism is still really, really strong. So anywhere on the coast, there is going to be opportunity in the right place. And tourism has benefited as well from security fears elsewhere in the world. So as a tourist destination, Spain is very strong. The key is to get the right location and to buy very, very carefully. Because as I said, there's been a lot of building. There's plenty to choose from. There are going to be plenty of people with incentives to try to market certain schemes, but location is really important. So you could find that the seafront property could be a great investment. But if you just go a couple of streets back, you might find lots and lots of empty units because it's just not so attractive. So Spain, I think, is one that's been popular in the past. It's always going to be popular. And at the moment, it's probably not a bad choice as long as it's approached with real caution and you make sure you do the research to get the location absolutely right.
Okay, so Spain is a popular country with UK investors. Another one that's been really popular is the USA. So a pretty big place and a really, really varied market. So there's not one piece of advice that you can give that will apply across the country. So let's dig in deeper. So first of all, you can get very strong yields in some places. Detroit, Michigan have been places banded as areas you can get very, very high yields, double digits easily, and plenty of others. But you have to be aware, because while some cities are doing very, very well from a yields point of view, they're actually shrinking. So Detroit, I know this sounds weird that cities are shrinking, but Detroit, for example, huge areas of the city have been bulldozed because there's just been empty homes. So you have to be careful. Many areas of the USA don't have the same supply and demand pressures that we have here in the UK. There's a lot of land. And yes, there's a lot of people, but there's a lot more land. The density of population is nowhere near the same as the UK. So you have to be careful of that. So because of that, there's less scope for capital growth. However, there are areas you can still achieve that. So places where supply and demand pressures do apply, like New York City, particularly Manhattan Island, or San Francisco, have seen plenty of uplift in capital growth terms over the last decades, really, particularly New York. So there are areas for capital growth, but just because you hear about it in New York doesn't mean it's going to apply somewhere that's not doing so well, like Detroit. So be very, very careful. Now, of course, there are lots of benefits to investing in the US. You've got lots of information. We share a common language, although they've butchered it a little bit. Just joking, right? Because whatever, we've got US listeners. So we've got a lot in common. So understanding the market there is a lot easier. It's got quite a robust legal system as well. So lots of benefits if you do go in. Just a big place. So doing your research and finding the right partner are absolutely critical. This applies to every country you look at. But it's worth mentioning now because it is so important. And researching that right partner is also critical because you can do the research on the areas but not research your partner and still get in trouble. So be careful. Income-focused investors can make it really work, and I know people who've done very well from it, but I've also known people who've lost big time from it as well because they've partnered with the wrong people and not done enough research. So make sure that you research very strongly the area that you're going to. The US is a very, very different country from city to city, so don't just apply the same rules to one city as another. If you do that, you could do well.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. It feels really daunting because it is just such a massive place, and the thought of trying to get the level of knowledge that you need is just it seems like a really big task. But having that right partner is, of course, really important. As long as you research that partner absolutely inside out, like you say, some people have made it work really, really well. Somewhere where people have historically not made it work so well is Eastern Europe, and I'm absolutely staggered by the number of people who I've spoken to or who we've had posting on the Property Hub forum talking about bad experiences that they've had in Bulgaria, especially. When it was around the time that they were joining the EU, this was sort of touted as the next big hotspot, the next really big opportunity. So there was lots of marketing going on to overseas investors, like in the UK, getting them to invest in Bulgaria. And a lot of people got caught up in that, and they got caught up in the story. They got excited about the money they could make, and they forgot to do the research and to research the partner and the area. So there are going to be lots of people who wouldn't touch Eastern Europe with a barge pole because they had a really terrible experience recently. But there's still lots of opportunity there. So he said that there are certain markets that are going to have features and might have growth potential beyond what you could get in the UK. And I say Eastern Europe is one of those places because of where it's starting from. There is the potential to get really big growth in certain places. Of course, there is just potential. It doesn't mean it's definitely going to happen. A lot could go wrong. But because you're starting from a low base and these countries are kind of emerging, there's new stability, they're emerging internationally, there is potential there. So in certain countries like Poland, the Czech Republic and Hungary, for example, the markets there are stable and there's the potential for them to do a lot more. So I've spent time in the last couple of years in the Czech Republic and in Hungary. And I know a couple of people who are actually buying in Hungary because they consider it to be a really great European base. It's pretty cheap, but it's also solid. There's good demand there, and they see the scope for things to just pick up and up. So there are definitely opportunities there. There are also emerging tourism hotspots. So Montenegro, for example, is tipped in our magazine article, and I've heard a couple of other people mention it as well, because apparently there's really good skiing there and you get lots of tourists from Russia going there. So in terms of holiday lets, that's a market that people are looking at as well. I think when it comes to Eastern Europe, the absolute key sentence is cheap is not the same as value. And this is where people went really wrong in the past. So they'd see somewhere where you could buy like a flat in Bulgaria for £15,000 or something and think, wow, it's so cheap. It's got to be good value. How could it not be? How could it not fly up? And then it goes down to being worth £5,000. Just because something's cheap doesn't mean that it's good value, doesn't mean that it's something that you want to be buying or to be owning. So if you keep that in mind and you can do your research and you can find something that is good value, it can be great. But of course, because of things like language barriers, not quite as easy to do that as it is in places like the US. But still, if you're feeling brave, there are some opportunities there.
So where next? Well, you'll be very pleased to know we are not going round the entire planet country by country. But we will pick out a few other areas of note. So quite a few people are tipping Egypt right now. So Egypt's had a lot of headlines, but not really for the right reasons. War, corruption, terrorism, there's lots of headlines there. So not a lot of positive PR. So why are people looking at Egypt at all? Well, there's a very old and famous quote from one of the members of the Rothschild family, which says, "The time to buy is when there's blood on the pavements." Not an investment strategy I would personally use, not one I feel comfortable with. But hey, if you're a bit more cold and you don't mind, then crack on. Rob, I believe one of your friends has tipped Georgia as an area.
Yeah, apparently so. Apparently Georgia is really emerging as one of those places that's very very international. There's increasing tourism there. There's a tech scene emerging there. Not something I know anything about, but a bit like Egypt, I suppose. It depends how early you want to get in. So there are certain places, like maybe you'd say, okay, like Poland or Hungary is somewhere where you're not getting in right at the start of the story, but you think that there's growth to come. If you want to get in right at the absolute bottom or right at the absolute start, then countries like Egypt and Georgia, that's the place to do it. But of course, that's where you make the biggest gains if you turn out to be right. But it's also where you can have a really bad time of it if it turns out you're not quite as clever as you thought you were.
And Rob would never do this, but I've seen it done plenty of times where a friend has invested overseas and they have deal bias and they've gone, oh yeah, I invested in such a country. It's been great. Yeah, perfect. And people have taken that as their research. Oh, well, if so-and-so's bought it, it must be good. I know I'm preaching to the wrong audience here because obviously you are people who educate yourselves listening to the Property Podcast. But if you see anyone else do it, stop them. And other areas to look at, well, I just like areas with supply and demand pressures, like the UK. So Malta springs to mind. Small island, lots of people, densely populated. People speak English. The legal system is very much based on the UK. So I quite like that as an area. I'm not saying you should buy. Again, that's not, Rob on the podcast said, do your research. But areas like that give me more confidence. You've got to be careful. And I think it's about time, while we've talked about all the positives and all the opportunity, that we give you some warnings, not to scare you, but just to make sure you don't get burnt.
Yeah, definitely. I always worry that we go too big on the warnings and just turn everything into a bit of a bore fest. So as we've been going along, we've been sort of trying to talk about the positives, but we must wrap up by talking about some of the risk factors and some general advice for making sure your experience overseas is a pleasant one. So as we've hinted at, by going and investing overseas, there is the scope for doing very well, for perhaps doing better than you would if you stayed at home. But the biggest disasters tend to be when people go outside areas they know. And if you go along to a meetup tonight, chances are you'll come across someone there who will be very happy to tell you about a nightmare experience they've had in Bulgaria or Spain or the US or somewhere else. You'll also come across a lot of glossy brochures and sales pitches for overseas property. So there can be some really big commissions involved in selling these. This is again where a lot of people went wrong last time. They bought into the hype and overlooked some of the downsides. So the real key is not to buy on the strength of a brochure, but to find the right local partner. You're not going to have an inherent feel for an area in the same way as you did if it's somewhere that you've always lived or you've lived for a long time. So finding the right partner is critical to make sure that you use their knowledge to make up for where yours is lacking. And as a general rule, we always say do your research. I'd say for overseas property, do 10 times as much research as you would in the UK. Because it's the lack of knowledge that is dangerous. And so you've got to do everything that you can to overcome that and get your knowledge up to where it would be if you're making any other kind of investment, if you want to avoid making mistakes. But even if you do all that research, there are still other risks that are kind of outside your control.
Well, while we mentioned it as a positive earlier, you've got the currency risk. It could go against you in a big way. If you've got an asset in a different country, a property, and you've got a mortgage that's in that currency, let's just say the Swiss franc, then if you are in the UK and suddenly the pound takes a massive hit, like it has done, your mortgage payments are significantly more expensive than they were because the pound isn't worth as much. So you have to pay a lot more than you did previously just because what you're paying with is worth a lot less. So currency risk, especially in mortgages, can really go against you. So be very careful. A huge one is understand the legal system. So many people look at the opportunity, they'll look at the rent, they'll look at the supply and demand, they'll do good research. But we take our legal system in the UK for granted, and it's one of the best in the world. Yes, conveyancing, and we've hammered solicitors a little bit in the past, can be a painful experience here in the UK. But in the vast majority of cases, it's safe, it's reliable, you know what you're getting. We've got one of the oldest land registries in the world. It's a safe place. And that's why so many people come from outside of the UK to invest in it because it's seen as a safe haven. Lots of other countries have pretty ropey legal systems. So make sure you understand it inside out and are extremely confident in its ability to protect you, because most of the horror stories, many of them anyway, that I hear are because of the legal system that has burned them subsequently. So be very, very careful. And I think a final thought, just to summarise on all of this, is just because the thought of overseas property is attractive, and it is, I daydream about it as well, it doesn't mean it's an attractive investment. So look back at your goals, and I hope you've got them, and decide, will this take me closer to my end goals or not? Can I invest somewhere else, maybe the UK, and get there more quickly? Am I doing this just because it feels emotionally good? Be careful, check yourself. And if it does take you closer and it is efficient, crack on. But just use that as your guiding light. Use that as your reference, your internal reference, just to make sure you're not getting carried away with the romance of investing overseas. And it is actually a good thing to do.
Excellent wrap up, Mr. B. And if you've had any experiences with overseas property, we'd love to hear them. So if you get over to the forum at thepropertyhub.net/forum, you'll find a thread for this week's topic. And if you've got any particular experiences that you'd like to add, good or bad, we'd really like to hear them and have the whole community learning from each other, sharing warnings and sharing tips as well. And you'll also find the show notes for this episode at thepropertyhub.net/aroundtheworld.
We've got a cracking resource. It's actually two resources working together to make it even more impressive coming up. But before we do, we've got a little iTunes review for you. And as we've got two resources, we'll give you two short reviews. We've got Elwood with the first one. Really excellent podcast, chock full of useful information. The presenters, Rob and Rob, make a great team and have a pleasant, laid-back, chatty style. I look forward to it every week. Thank you very much. So do we. And we've got Schmall Time Investor. Yes, they were spelt that way, Schmall. I've been listening intently since the beginning, so forgive my tardiness for writing a review. This is my first ever review. So thank you so much for all the clear and current advice and useful information. The Robs rock. Well, thank you for staying with us for all that amount of time. We haven't put you off yet. There's been quite a lot of podcasts. And thank you for making your first review. Even though it's been a while, it does make us feel good that we're your first.
Yes, thank you very much. Very much appreciated. So let's see if we can repay you with a Double Trouble resource of the week. So we've got one resource in common that we each use in a slightly different way. So Rob, why don't you share what it is and how you use it? And then I've got another option to add in as well.
So I've talked about these resources individually in the past. Now, Pocket is the first one. Pocket is a brilliant app. You can install it on your web browser, and every time you see an article that interests you, you click the button and it will be sent straight to your app. The reason I really love it is because you can read the articles offline as well. So very, very clever. You can clip articles from your phone, from your desktop. Great, great resource. My previous frustration with this app is I've had to use another app to read my RSS feeds. So RSS feeds are where you get all the articles from blogs you like. And there are maybe half a dozen blogs that I just love to read time and time again. So what I've done is used Zapier. Zapier is another brilliant app that we've talked about multiple times. Go and check it out. I'm not going to give you a full debrief on what it is now. But basically, Zapier connects apps. It connects different apps. So what I've done is the blogs, the RSS feeds that I really enjoy, I send them to Zapier, and then Zapier automatically sends them to Pocket. So Pocket now is not just a tool I can clip articles, but it's also my RSS reader. So I've managed to get two apps in one with that little hack. It made me very excited. I did it on a Saturday morning. Probably shows the boringness of my actual life. It's probably nowhere near as exciting as people think. But it made me very happy, so I thought I'd share it.
Yeah, Zapier is a brilliant tool, and I use it in a slightly different way. I use Pocket for reading offline. So if ever I've got a train journey or something like that, I always make sure that I've filled up Pocket with plenty of stuff to read offline in case I haven't got a signal. But I start off in Feedly, which is another tool that we've talked about before, which is basically a central hub that you can pull all your blog subscriptions into. And there I connect it with Zapier to Pocket. So I can just go through a huge number of blogs, basically scan the headings, decide what I want to read, and then just individually fire off specific articles to Pocket. So rather than having them all go into there by default, I just get the ones I want. So there's two different ways of combining these tools. And it might sound geeky. You might have already zoned out and started thinking about what you're going to have for lunch, but it is really useful. It's worth spending a little bit of time exploring this stuff and seeing how you can make it work for you, because there's just so much information out there. You're not necessarily just going to sort of sit at your laptop and go from website to website. But if you can find a way of getting it into your flow so you get the right information, it's really easy for you to look at when you're just kind of like waiting on the train platform or whatever. It's really helpful. It's a great way of making sure that you turn that dead time into an opportunity to learn something or to be entertained. If, of course, you've run out of property podcast episodes at that point.
Or you've finished reading the property magazine. Because this article, as Rob said at the top of the show, is from the magazine. And the reason why we love doing the magazine so much is this particular article is going to be over 5 pages. So we can go into massive depth, which is great because you can take so much more from it. So hopefully we've given you a lot from the podcast, but you can learn so much more from the magazine. If you want to get this latest issue, which is out soon, you've got 1 week. There's 1 week before the next edition ends. So this comes out on a Thursday. By the time the next podcast comes out, you've run out of time. You might be able to get the next one, so don't be put off. But if you want to read more about this article and many, many others, then make sure you go to thepropertyhub.net/magazine. It's a £5. I mean, that's incredible value, and that includes delivery. So make sure you get it. You won't be disappointed.
And we're now throwing in a free webinar each time for magazine subscribers, so the amount of value you're packing in for a £5 is not bad, if you ask me. So if you are not subscribed to the magazine, head off and do that now. You could also check out the show notes for this episode at thepropertyhub.net/aroundtheworld. We'll be back with Ask Rob and Rob on Tuesday, and then a very exciting episode of the Property Podcast next Thursday. We'll not say any more about that right now, but it's going to be a good one. For now, though, thank you for joining us. Have a good week. Have fun. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Thanks for listening to the Property Podcast. For show notes, all our past episodes, and to leave a review, go to thepropertyhub.net/podcast.